So you have, yeah, fine.
Perfect. Is it working?
Should be.
See. This one?
Yeah.
אוקיי. איך מדליקים את זה?
פה, יש לך את הכפתור של און. אני אוסיף פה את המסך, לא להאמין. אני משך לו את יותר מדי.
I'm sorry.
No, no problem.
We need to improvise. לא, זה לא טוב. זה יכול להיות באמצע הזה. I'm going to put my bag.
Yeah, sure.
This is
Okay.
And
okay. I'll be here back in a minute.
where is the...
We have changed the input.
Yeah.
Is it F5 usually? No.
No, maybe it's... No. That's this one.
Maybe displays.
No, it's not saying this one. Yes, now see another one.
Okay.
כן? אני חושבת משאיר לך לעבור. וגם יעבור לילד שלו. ואם אנחנו תובעים כזה,
אולי תרצו את זה עד שילד שנה, שפשוט צריך לעשות לילד שלו עד שילד.
עכשיו אתם מחכים בעצם למסמכים שלו? בעצם
כמעט כל זמנים. כל המרק שעושה קטנית זה כל כך של השנים.
הוא היה נותן לעבור מילים?
שכרגע יש בזה צורך.
לא, נגיד איך אנחנו עושים בכל הצליחה. שזה מאוד חשוב. אני נורא רוצה, אבל אני חושבת שאני אהיה בשבתון, אז אני לא יודעת. לכן אני ישבתי. אני רוצה להיות בשבתון ברומא בתקופה הזאת, כי אני לא יודעת. נכון, אני יודעת. זה הבעיה שאני מחכה לוויזה לאיטליה. לא, חושבים שזה מדעי, אנחנו רוצים לעבוד שם באוניברסיטה. אז לזה אני מחכה.
מה זה חצי שנה?
אני תכננתי.
מה זה? עכשיו לא עושה את
ממש לפחות הכל, וגם המערכת שלי ברוך השם, תלכייה בכל המערכת. הבקשה צריכה לתת באוניברסיטה שם. וכאן אני כבר בקשרי ידידות עם השקפים.
להיות מירורינג או וואט?
שתגידו מי הבן אדם שצריך שם.
שלום.
היי.
בסדר.
No, or
I
just
just know, it doesn't matter, yeah, I won't, I don't need to see the slides.
זה בחרתי את איטליה, כי אני לא יכולה לבוא לזה, אני ניסעתי שם לתרגיל פתאום תהיה בצבא, אז בכל זאת כן לבוא ישירות.
And then I'll just show you my presentation.
אבל לכן לא נרשמתי,
I just converted a PDF because I wasn't, I have the proper keynote.
אמרתי, ומה זה ישנה? בחדר גם, מה יקרה בחדר?
But I can open up the original file.
נכון, מה שחבל לי שיש משהו להציג שאני רוצה, וזה...
Yeah, the Hebrew.
אבל היא לא תציג את זה, כי זה טוב, כי זה לא שאני פתאום מעניין, כן, זה מתקף מאוד יפה שם, זה זמן נורא, כזה זה מתחיל לעבוד על זה ולהציג.
Okay, cool. Oh, okay, I got it. Okay, cool.
this is my this.
כן, זהו. זה כנראה מאמץ גדול.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much for your help.
לא יודע לגבי רומא, אבל יש מאירופה, מגרמניה, בדרך כלל אירופה, יש מלא שם, קהילת נוספת בכל התארים חולמים של ארגון של ככה, קהילת ישראל נורא.
אנחנו נוסעים ועושים את הכסף.
מה, זה נורא יקר. ללון באילת.
אז הכנס הזה הוא מסוסס.
לא, אני מדברת על הפולנים, לא...
טוב, דרך אגב, בחורף, אז הפולנים האלה, כל כך קמצנים, הם יורדים למטוס וישר הולכים לחפש חוף שלא צריך לשלם לו כלום, הם ישנים על חוף. אחרי זה הם מקיימים בים המלח לירושלים בטרמפים, ושם מוצף בפולנים שעושים טרמפים. כן, אבל הם מבסוטים. הסיפורים שלהם זה איך הם ישנו אתמול בחינם בירושלים, בקאץ' סרפינג, ומחר הם ישנו בחינם.
מתקלבים כמו ישראלים באסיה.
לא,
מאיפה קיבלנו את זה?
בדיוק, זה השמטה.
זה המרוקאית לא מתקלבים.
לא, רק לא.
באמת היא?
חינכנו את המרוקאים גם.
לא, אני מגיעה לזה שבחיים גם שלא היה לי שקל לזה, חלקתי יותר מדי בבית, ולא התקלבתי, לא הצלחתי לעשות את זה.
בשני בחומש, ואנחנו מתחילים את השיטות שדה, עם הסטודנטים, אבל יכול להיות שאני אצטרך להגיע בלילה. הרי הרוב בתאונה,
אתה מדבר על...
שניים בדצמבר.
כן. אני בדיוק בפרובנס בשבוע.
מוסכים שלי.
אוקיי.
חשבתי להידבק.
איזה כיף.
מה, לישון?
לא, להקפיץ אותי, כי לשעה יוכל להישאר איתם.
באיזה שעה אתה מגיע?
בערב, יש לי לפי התכנון, אתה יודע שאני מחכה לפעילות.
אולי לא אותו?
יש לי לחימה לאלימות ותקיפה.
גם לא אותו, העניין הזה.
נמשיך, זה לא נגמר. אז הגעתי עכשיו לסיכום בשעה שסוגרים אותי בלי כלום בעצם. ולא הייתי אלים באמת, ולא הייתי... והבן שלי שגם הייתי, ולא מתאים לעמוד בכלל בהתנאות. זה בכלל תפסות. משהו, אתה לא מבין מה זה.
מה הייתי? אני רואה שהסתפרת, התגלחת.
כן,
אתה לא מבין. אתה לא מבין עד כמה זה גדול.
כן, לא, אני יכול לקרוא את זה.
קיצור, קפקאי גם, עולה לי 20 שקלים. אבל בסדר, זה בסדר, זה סתם, אבל זה סתם. גם לי זה סתם, לא נגעתי את זה בדם, זה לא פשוט. אבל תראו לי את התהליך לעשות שלום.
בקיצור, אני בשבוע הזה, אני ראשון, אני ממשיך לא נמצא.
מה בסדר פה?
זה לא כנס, זה סדנה.
זה מאוד כזה.
היה לי שיחה עם המנהל ברגע.
הוא אמר לי, כן.
הוא בסדר?
בסדר לא הולכים למקורת, אבל בסדר.
הוא בדבר הזה.
כן.
מחכה לכניסתו של
כל המעבדה שלנו,
ההורים
אז מי בעצם מעבדה?
פתאום זה לא there's a graph with the opposite. There's a chart with the opposites and the lots.
So after the seminar, I'll show you where are the different tools,
Okay.
and then you'll be
Yeah.
on your own.
That sounds good.
Okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect.
אז האמת היא שזה אפילו ברמה של מורים.
כן? תקפתי לשם?
אני לא יכול ללכת לשלוש. זה בעצם בכניסת העילות.
לא, זה אני יודע. טיפוסתי למעלה.
לא, אבל זה לא ישנים למעלה, הם ישנים ממש קרוב לכביש 90.
על אחד הבאות הזה?
זה איפה זה שונה.
כן, כן, אני יודע את זה מה.
שם בחר. אלף יום שינה את הדרך.
זה בעיה, זה אני כזה...
אני יודע את זה.
זה גם איתו. לא, זה בסדר, זה בסדר. אני לא יודע שהוא יושב למעלה. הוא לא אמר.
כשאני הייתי אצלו זה מה שהוא רוצה, אבל אחרי זה הוא חבר שאתה כך, אולי שינה את הדרך.
זה של עומר.
בוא נספר את הסיפור. היינו בקוסטריקה. הלכנו לים.
והוא לך כל הקודם.
בטורטוגה לים. כשחזרנו לאוטו היה פרוץ, אפילו את הערבים. הכל, נשארנו עם בגדיה. יהושע לקח את הדברים מאוד קשה, כי הוא היה חייב לקום לפני. איך יכול להיות שיש רוע בעולם?
Welcome to the world.
בסדר, היה שיעור טוב, אבל זה היה מבחר, לא משנה. ואז היינו צריכים, לא היה לנו כלום. זה מהכנסייה קיבלנו תרומה. כן, אבל הייתי צריך לעזור. עזרתי לאמא של אחד הערבים שם, עזרתי לו לאדום מקרב למקום למקום, ואז הוא עקר אותי.
אבל זה מה? זה קבוצה ישראלית.
לא, כנסייה. לא יודע אם זה ישראלי.
הוא אמר ככה וככה.
אז זה של בתיה. תודה.
I'm excited.
I didn't take measurements.
No, I do.
Oh, you did. Oh, you did. Yeah. I briefly met this morning and then I'll have a meeting.
Really good. You've been here before?
No, this is my first time. Yeah, it's only my second time to Jerusalem.
How long have you been in Israel?
So I moved back and forth from the States. So give it a
My favorite one is the stuff.
Peter, do you know how to control your computer so it will be smaller?
Most of the slides won't go over. I think most of the figures are actually the same. I can see. I had the same issue. It's good.
someone that's a Weizmann? You also have somebody that's going to
Yeah. The department's pretty broad.
Okay. Next week now. Today we have Dr. Peter Crawford from Weizmann Institute of Science in Princeton University. He did his undergrad and master at Victoria University in British Columbia. And then he did his PhD at McGill University. And today, as I said, he's a postdoc at Weizmann Institute of Science and Princeton. He's working together there. And he's going to talk about triple oxygen isotopes as life with the proterozoa. Thanks.
Just a reminder.
I wanted to say it later, but go ahead.
So that tomorrow, since some of the analysis are not going to be tomorrow, so tomorrow there's going to be a lecture by Tanir Klein from Weizmann University that has a more environmental aspect of it, about the lifetime of trees in Israel over the past few decades and information.
And if we are already in announcement, exactly, we'll say that next week we'll have the Bento Prize and lecture. The lecture will be by Nick Carlson, and also Sonia Esperanza will come from the NSF and will even talk about how to write proposals.
What if I just turn?
No, it's not the right, exactly. And then also this.
Okay, so thanks so much for having me here. So today I'm going to be presenting what were some of the highlights of my PhD work, as Yaakov said at McGill, which was basically going around the world, gathering samples of sulfate, but really trying to tackle this question of how productive was the ancient biosphere over Earth history, thinking about much longer scales of time. And so why I was interested in this question is because the rate at which the biosphere really cycles elements through the surface Earth is kind of a master variable when we think about the evolution of the atmosphere, even the solid Earth in some cases, but especially the oceans. And so I know not everybody studies Earth on very long time scales, so I thought I'd just situate us in time, but as well as just highlighting why I think this question is interesting. So we know that the sun has gotten brighter through Earth history. This is a function of converting hydrogen to helium in the sun's core, increases its density, increases the pace of nuclear reactions, and that's expressed by us by an increase in brightness over Earth history. And an interesting observation when we look in the sedimentary record through deep time is that there's this lack of glacial deposits over the vast majority of Earth history. Okay, so we have some pronounced intervals about 2.5 billion years ago, about 700 million years ago, and then some glaciations throughout the Phanerozoic or the post-Precambrian, or something like that. But how would the Earth compensate for that? So that leads to these models of the evolving composition of greenhouse gases, namely CO2. Okay, and so it's predicted that this would slowly decrease as the sun's gotten brighter through Earth history. And then when we think of the biosphere that's ultimately going to be sucking up a lot of this, we have these broad records from looking at microfossils and molecular clocks that we definitely started with prokaryotes sometime maybe around 4 billion years ago, maybe a little bit later. Eventually, one prokaryote eats another one, and for some reason, it doesn't die, and we get eukaryotes, and life gets a little bit bigger, and then eventually we get animals. And this history, this broad history of the biosphere seems to somewhat come in conjunction with these rises in atmospheric oxygen. But again, there's huge amounts of error when we think of how low values were in the Archean, but especially over most of the Proterozoic, where we still can't really refine this more than a couple orders of magnitude. And what I would argue is that if we don't really know exactly what the biosphere is doing, it's always going to be difficult to constrain things like the history of the atmosphere, the history of the carbon cycle. And obviously this is going to have big implications for when we think of going further down on the Earth's surface and the history of the oceans, whether we're thinking about redox, where we'll have a history of shallow marine oxygenated waters, and a complex history of euxinic and ferruginous environments, and changing seawater pH, obviously the rate at which the biosphere cycles elements is going to have impacts on this. And if we think more broadly, why would anyone care about the Proterozoic? Especially as we're making all these exoplanet discoveries, one could argue that the early Earth is the closest exoplanet we're ever actually going to see, and it's a completely foreign planet to most of us. And so perhaps when we do find life somewhere else, it'll probably be more reflective of this early Earth dominated in the microbial world. So understanding a bit more about that, I think, is an interesting question. So thinking about this question of how the size of the biosphere productivity has changed through time, one way we can kind of conceptualize it is if we look from results from a recent compilation by Baron et al., this is from Ron Milo's group at Weizmann. If we just think about the biosphere today, and we want to just say, how big is it? You know, and we get a sack and we start bagging up components and putting it on a really large scale, we see that, okay, most of the biomass is sucked up in plants, they're heavy. We have a little bit of animals, some fungi, some variable amount depending on how we think of the deep biosphere. But if we imagine if we go back in time to the Proterozoic, if we start calving off a lot of these pieces, we kill all of the land plants, we kill all of the animals, we remove all the fungi, does that necessarily mean that we had a much smaller biosphere? And if it does that mean that the fluxes of things like oxygen produced to the atmosphere and sucking up CO2, would those fluxes in turn be drastically reduced when we think of the early Earth? Okay. And so that's really the question of this. How has the size of the biosphere really changed through Earth history? As we move from anoxygenic chemolithotrophs to oxygenic photosynthesizers, eukaryotes and animals, have we actually increased the amount of life on the planet? So if we think of this question today, there's been a lot of clever advances in how we can actually probe this in the modern environment. So if we calibrate satellites in an interesting way to pick up chlorophyll in the oceans, we can look at maps of the whole Earth and integrate this and get a sense of how much production is actually going on in the ocean. And we can run a similar non-trivial change to the continents and try to measure this on land as well. Or we can do these bottle incubations where we take a piece of seawater, we measure gas exchange fluxes or isotopes, and then integrate this over a large area to get an idea of this question. But if we go back in time, it becomes incredibly challenging. So if we were to crash all of our satellites, sink all of our ships, what would we do? So today we're going to rely on the atmosphere. So it's very clear that without life on the planet, we would have a very, very different composition of our atmosphere. So it's been pointed out for a long time by people like James Lovelock that if we killed all the life on Earth, there's no way we would maintain the compositions of oxygen and methane in the proportions they are today, right? These gases are in disequilibrium. If there wasn't biological fluxes maintaining them, we would quickly run away from our current composition. But what I'm going to talk about is actually looking at the isotopic compositions of ancient oxygen to try to get at this question. So a lot of this work was really pioneered here, which is why I'm really happy to be here, maybe nervous for the Q&A, but let's see. Okay, for those of you who don't speak isotope, I know some people here speak it much better than me, so we all know that isotopes are elements with differing numbers of neutrons, subtly changes their mass. This subtly changes the rate at which bonds are broken and reformed, and we can measure these with very high precision in Earth materials, okay? And because these effects are on the order of 1% or a few tenths of percent, we present this on the per mil scale, okay, or parts per thousand. I know some of you here might be used to per meg, so parts per million, but I'm just going to use per thousand today. And so we'll measure our samples relative to some agreed upon standard over a standard and get our values. Okay, so we have two classes of isotope effects. First one is mass-dependent effects, where subtle changes of mass subtly change the physical chemical properties of the substances they inhabit. And you can think of this in oxygen space, for example, where if we make a substitution, for example, in oxygen 17 for an 18, because we are switching a mass unit from 1 to 2, we get an effect that's about half. So this defines the slope of this line of about 0.5. And in oxygen space, this should really define most reactions that exist on the surface Earth, okay? Just about everything. But what was pointed out as early as the 1970s was there was another class of materials that seemed to not obey this mass dependence, okay? So this is where results initially from Bob Clayton, where he was measuring things, extraterrestrial materials, and he found that some of these fell off this line, okay, this terrestrial fractionation line, defined by this 0.5 slope, okay? And initially, understanding that everything obeys mass dependence, they simply thought there was some other oxygen reservoir in space. We were getting some mixing between these two reservoirs, and that explains everything, okay? But then Bob Clayton had a postdoc, Mark Tiemens, who wasn't satisfied with that answer. And so en route to his faculty job at UC San Diego, leaving CU Chicago, he wanted to design an experiment to see if there was actually an underlying process that was creating these deviations from this mass-dependent line that seemed to define like all substances on Earth. And what he did was a very simple experiment. He just took oxygen, started to spark it in a little box, and created some ozone and residual O2. And by doing that, what he found after measuring the isotopes was the ozone, here in purple, became isotopically enriched, mass-independently isotopically enriched. Okay? And residual O2 was isotopically depleted, and seemed to be defined in this line by a line of 1 rather than 0.5. Seemed to fit these observations quite well. Okay? So this was very interesting. And so we had the second isotope effect, which we can define as a mass-independent isotope effect, which we define just as a deviation from mass dependence, okay? And here we're going to use this high-temperature fractionation of 5305, which some of you use something a little bit different, but for our purposes today, it's not a big deal. Now, beyond just being an interesting observation that was for extraterrestrial materials and some process that we could produce in the lab, this actually had consequences for things that we can now apply to Earth, okay? So when people went out and measured other gases on the surface Earth, they found actually that indeed ozone seems to have this mass-independent isotopic enrichment. So does nitrate, so does CO2, so does peroxide, okay? So it seemed like there was an imprint being left on these gases. And obviously here from this graph, you can see basically everything's plotted positive, and so something has to be balancing this out. And of course the answer was atmospheric oxygen. And so what people did is then they started to think of how exactly could these mass-independent fractionations be existing on Earth? And so the mechanism that was proposed is basically sunlight comes in, it breaks up ozone, and it preferentially kicks off a heavy oxygen, oxygen 17 or 18. These oxygens that are represented by Q can react with gases like CO2 and temporarily be removed from recombining with the O2. Okay? What this does is it leaves this mass-independent depletion in residual O2 that can then flux down to the troposphere and mix in with gases from biospheric fluxes. Okay? And so this was modeled initially by Yak Young, and eventually this relationship with CO2 concentrations was actually developed in the lab by Wen and Tiemens in 1993. And so for some of you interested in recent paleoclimate history, obviously this is interesting. We have something that seems to show a sensitivity to CO2 that we can hopefully analyze if we have some measurement of O2 in the ancient Earth. Okay? And so this relationship was established where we have some relationship where the magnitude of our depletion is going to be proportional to our atmospheric CO2 concentration. Okay? Obviously there's going to be some dependence on other gases, but CO2 is the major driver. Okay? And these reactions even leave a mass-independent depletion in modern atmospheric oxygen, measurements made by folks here, as well as in other labs, where we have about minus 0.5 per mil mass-independent depletion, or CAP17 value, okay, in the modern Earth. Now, a recent example, fairly recent example, okay, is that we can see these sorts of relationships even in the ice core record. So, as snow rains down in places like Antarctica and Greenland, or some of the high alpine glaciers in some spots, eventually the snow accumulates, it traps atmospheric samples, and they get eventually frozen as these gas bubbles, okay? And if we measure, for example, the CO2 in these, we get these great climate records. So if we go up in time here along the y-axis from 60,000 years ago to the present, you see CO2 concentrations have gone from much lower during the last glaciation, and they eventually rise as we move into the interglacial to pre-industrial levels in this record. Okay? Now, if we measure coexisting O2 in these gas bubbles, along with the CO2, we see this great relationship where increasingly negative Cap17 values, okay, mass-independent anomalies, correlate with increasing CO2 levels. Okay? And so this is results from Blunier and others in 2002. But what I'll talk about today is what happens when we think we know about ancient atmospheric composition. We figure out what we think this relationship should do, and we still see a deviation from this line. Okay? And so the flux we'll be talking about is the strength of the biosphere, the rate of O2 production to the atmosphere, okay? Which is going to source oxygens from water with a composition of about 0 per mil. Okay, obviously it's non-trivial why this varies in subtle degrees, but for my purposes today, I'm just going to simplify this. Okay? And so what this oxygen production from the biosphere can tell us is perhaps it's a proxy for gross primary production, okay, for the total carbon fixed by autotrophs in the biosphere, okay. Some people have made arguments for how this could be net primary production, but I know work here has argued that it's gross primary production, which I'm following for this talk as well, okay. Okay, so we have this oxygen production from the biosphere, which we're going to approximate as the gross primary production of the biosphere, that should be obeying this mass-dependent fractionation. And then we have stratospheric reactions, photochemical reactions, that are going to rain down O2 from the stratosphere. It's going to flood our atmospheric reservoir with more oxygen 16-16 bonds than we'd otherwise predict, leading to a mass-independent depletion in these heavy isotopes. Okay? And we're going to try to leverage that to learn something about Earth history. And so, a quick problem in terms of trying to apply this through deep time is that the ice core record at best only goes back about 2.5 million years. Okay, now these are unhinged ice blocks from Antarctica. It's a very fragmentary record. The only complete records we have only extend back about 800,000 years. So clearly we need another Earth archive to exploit if we want to get at these values. And so my approach, in following people like Huiming Bao, has been to take advantage of the fact that oxygen comes in through the atmosphere. It oxidizes pyrites on the continent, producing sulfates. You know, sulfate does a very good job of holding onto its oxygens after initial oxidation. Okay, and what's been shown in the lab is that a portion of the O2 and product sulfate is actually coming from the atmosphere. So most of it comes from water, again with a Cap17 value of approximately 0. The rest coming from O2, which is going to have this mass-independent depletion. And if we can backtrack from sulfate and have some sort of mixing that happened during initial pyrite oxidation, we can get back to original O2 compositions. Okay? And if we can do that, perhaps we can try to tease out this balance of stratospheric reactions and the strength of this biospheric flux. Okay? So one way to think about this is that perhaps if we had higher CO2 in Earth history, it'd be reflected by a much larger mass-independent reaction. If we had a stronger biosphere in Earth history, perhaps it would dilute stratospheric gases more, and we'd have less depletion in our samples. Okay, so our approach was pretty simple. Sample as many sulfates as we could, use the sulfate triple oxygen values, correct that back to original O2 values. We would add this in with constraints on atmospheric CO2 and O2, and then try to learn something about the ancient biosphere. Okay? And so this required gathering samples from all over the world. Okay, I was really fortunate over my PhD. I got to do a lot of work in the Canadian Arctic, a lot on Baffin Island and other spots. I was working in southwest US, Spain, parts of Australia, and then relied on collaborators heavily for samples from Africa, Iran, India, parts of Russia, and parts of Scandinavia. And these different stars just show the different time periods we sampled. So everything from what I'm simplifying is the Great Oxidation Event, so Paleoproterozoic, starting about 2.5 billion years ago, mid-Proterozoic, encompassing from about 2 billion years ago to about 1.2 billion years ago, late Proterozoic, Cryogenian, Ediacaran, and then some modern samples. And so some of this work was really, really thrilling to do. So here's my colleague Marcus Kunzman. We're on the cliffs of northern Baffin Island here. These are billion-year-old carbonates. And within these, we did find some sulfate in these thin beds, okay? And I don't know if you can see the ocean here, but we're like a few hundred meters up. I don't like heights, but this is pretty thrilling work. Another shot, this is from the Mackenzie Mountains in northwest Canada, just sitting at the Yukon-Northwest Territory border. This is where we have these great Neoproterozoic successions that have been thrust over Devonian rocks. And here the expression of evaporites is quite a bit different. So here's about 100 meters thick of just pure gypsum stacked on top of each other. And in some parts along this mountain range, you can get deposits up to 1 kilometer thick. Okay, and this brought its own challenges. So here we were basically just crawling through the dirt all day to gather samples. And so what I was able to do over my PhD was pulling all these samples together was to stitch together an isotopic record of Proterozoic sulfate. Okay, so we have multiple sulfurs, so Cap33 measurements at the bottom, major sulfur isotope measurements here, major oxygen, and then triple oxygen at the top. And so everything in gray is being samples from previous studies, and everything in red was what I produced over my PhD. And so obviously the major sulfur isotope record is a lot more complete, but I think we made a real contribution to things like minor sulfur isotopes and especially oxygen isotopes through deep time. But today I'm just going to really focus on the triple oxygen isotope record. And so here's the record of sulfate over all of Earth history, or at least the Proterozoic, as long as we have these deposits. And so I'm sure some people, their eyes are immediately drawn to this stuff over the Cariginian. These are these snowball Earth glaciations. We're going to ignore that today, but feel free to ask questions about that after. I can talk about why they're an interesting case. But if we look at broad trends in this record, you can see that we have a modern distribution here. Here's marine sulfate in this light blue bar, modern tropospheric O2 around minus 0.5 here. And you can see there's this trend of getting a little bit more negative as we move into the Ediacaran and the late Proterozoic, mid-Proterozoic, and then kicking back up across the Great Oxidation Event. And I think that some of these results were really, really exciting to pull off the machine. So one thing I want to draw your attention to is these values, especially over the mid-Proterozoic, that are more negative than modern tropospheric O2. Okay, so remember, sulfate only captures a fraction of the atmospheric signal. And what this means is that if we find sulfates with more negative values than the most negative reservoir we have in the modern environment, they must have been deposited under an Earth system state that's a lot different than today. Some combination of CO2, O2, and primary production had to lead to these very different values. So even if you don't believe anything else I say today, I think this is a very unambiguous signal that we're pulling from a very different atmosphere. Okay? So I'm going to give you an example now of just how we interpreted some of these results and then walk you through that in detail, and then we'll zoom back out for the rest of the record. Okay? So these are results from the 1.4 billion-year-old Sibley group. These are from Ontario, Canada. And a long time ago, this region was very prospective for uranium mines, so there's a lot of drill cores available to pull from, and some of them pulled up some evaporite minerals, some gypsum that we could eventually use for our study. And the interesting thing about this basin was that the interpretation is that it was actually a lake deposit. So 1.5 billion years ago, there was this lake. Eventually it evaporated a few times and created some sulfate salts for us to measure. And why we found that interesting and hoped that it would provide some interesting results was that at this time there wasn't really a terrestrial biosphere. And so one of the dangers in doing these measurements is that some sulfur cycling after initial oxidation could reset our oxygen isotope. So as sulfate goes to sulfide, it transfers through these intermediates like thiosulfate and sulfite, and that has opportunity for oxygen exchange with ambient water. So hope was in terrestrial samples, we would actually limit this sort of isotopic exchange and get to these pristine atmospheric samples. And so here's our results from the Sibley group, just plotted a different way, just as a histogram with the number of values along the y-axis and increasingly more negative triple oxygen values along the x-axis. And again, you can see that almost all of the values from this deposit plot more negative than modern tropospheric O2. Okay, so how do we interpret this? So again, we're going to try to think about initial oxidation products, try to get at this balance between atmospheric chemistry and the productivity of the biosphere. And so our approach was basically to rely on previous constraints of atmospheric oxygen and CO2. Okay, even though there's error bars with these estimates, they're much less than the error on when people have thought about this biospheric flux of oxygen. So just to give you a sense of how people have plugged in this productivity number into ancient models of the carbon cycle or ancient biospheric fluxes, people have put in anything from modern levels to about 1/millionth the size. Okay, and because there hasn't been really any quantitative constraints, there's been no problems in publishing in high-profile journals, creating these ideas about the ancient Earth. Okay, we're going to add in impacts of isotopes in these stratospheric reactions. So what I mean by that is, if we start changing O2, CO2 ratios in these photochemical reactions, does that actually change the distribution of isotopes between CO2 and O2 and stuff? And so this has been experimentally calibrated by folks like Rabina Shaheen. Okay, so we'll rely on their results. We're going to assume all triple oxygen values are valid. So one could argue that the most negative values are the most pristine, but at least the less negative ones have been altered away from some primary value from some post-depositional process. Okay, but because these values vary up stratigraphically quite a bit, it's unclear whether this is real variation through the basin or some diagenetic impact. So we're going to try to be conservative and assume everything could be real. We're going to assume stratosphere-tropospheric exchange is the same as the modern environment. This isn't something that's very trivial to do, but nobody's really investigated how this flux would change when we completely change the composition of the atmosphere. Some people have played around with this value when we think of anthropogenic climate change, but nobody's actually extended this back in time to the ancient Earth. And then again, we're going to vary how much oxygen gets into sulfate during pyrite oxidation over the full experimentally determined range, about 8 to 15%. Okay, so then what we did is we basically varied these things over whatever range we thought was suitable. We pick a value at some point of each of these variables. We randomly sample it through a Monte Carlo approach, and we get some probability distribution of what the biosphere was likely like. Okay? And so again, most of these things have been experimentally determined. Most of these variables come from chemical experiments in the lab. Okay, that's what most of these are. Again, here's our pyrite oxidation experiments. Again, we're going to look at modern stratosphere-tropospheric exchange, but we're still going to assume about 50% error on either side. So somewhere between 50% as strong as today or 150% of what it is today. This is just mass transfer across the tropopause, delivering these mass-independent oxygens into the troposphere. Okay, and then we're going to think about atmospheric chemistry. So what have people thought about ancient CO2? So obviously this is an interesting question. A lot of people have put a lot of effort into it, but it's still burdened by enormous error bars. Okay, so we have 1D radiative transfer modeling by people like Paris et al. But for our estimates, what we thought was the most reasonable constraints to place on this was some general circulation modeling by Wolf and Toon. And so what this upper bound is basically if we imagine an ice-free Earth, okay, sitting about 300 degrees Kelvin, or about 27 degrees, they modeled this for just a pure CO2 atmosphere, negating the warming effects of anything like nitrogen, nitrogen-bearing compounds, nothing else, just a pure CO2 atmosphere. And so that seems to be a fairly conservative upper constraint because there should be some warming from a little bit of methane and other things. At the lower end, even though this agrees with some things like paleosols or some modeling studies, the constraint we imposed was basically asking, what CO2 level did the Earth cross to start glaciating Antarctica? Okay, this is a time period on Earth with no ice on the planet, or at least no reported glacial deposit. So we figured that if the sun was a little less bright in Earth's past and we have no evidence for glaciation, setting that boundary at about what the recent Earth was for glaciating Antarctica seemed to be a reasonable lower constraint, okay, at about 2 times pre-industrial levels. And so we vary CO2 between these two end members. Now, atmospheric oxygen, there's seen a lot more debate. So again, we can rely on things that have taught us about what the Archean atmosphere was like with sulfur mass independent fractionation. Studies that have relied on atmospheric stability, arguing that if we have O2 that's too low, we would build up methane. We get hooked on that as a greenhouse gas, and then one day we oxidize it and we plunge into a glaciation. but that's not consistent with the sedimentary record, so we're probably a bit higher than these levels. And then there's estimates of establishing an ozone layer, which we need for our triple oxygen isotope results. And so we're setting this as our lower limit at about 0.1% modern. Coming in from the other end, we can say, well, what's the marine record consistent with? If we don't have fully oxygenated oceans, what kind of constraint does that place? And so that's somewhere between about 10 and 40% of modern oxygen levels. But it's really in this region of about 10% modern to 0.1% modern where all the debate is. Now, the reason that this is sort of a hot question is because it really asks the question of, like, why did animals take so long to evolve? So did the Proterozoic environment not allow animals to survive because oxygen concentrations were just too low for their metabolic requirements? Or was there plenty of oxygen and we just had to wait for some evolutionary steps for them to exist? So that really is why the debate continues, but it can really be divided into, if we look at this record and zoom out, it's really, if we're too low, we're in an Archean environment. At some intermediate level, the atmosphere would probably be unstable, which isn't consistent with the sedimentary record. And then there's this blue region where people argue, okay? And so this is our constraint that we're going to place from 0.1 to 10% modern, varied over 2 orders of magnitude. Okay? And so again, this is just put another way, this is if we pool these sort of estimates across all of Earth history, or at least most of Proterozoic, okay? And so in orange we have CO2, in blue we have O2, and these are the constraints we place for all of our samples, okay? But again, we're just going to think about these 1.4 billion-year-old samples first. And again, we're just going to impose these constraints, sample them at random over these distributions, and get some result. So here was our results for 1.4 billion years ago. Okay. Again, we have a few samples that seem to imply we could have greater than modern production. But again, these are extreme outliers in our CAP17 values and take a very generous sampling of these other parameters. Okay. But most values seem to plot well below that and seem to suggest we probably had something like an order of magnitude less production on the planet 1.4 billion years ago. And again, compared to previous work that would vary this off the scales, anywhere from modern to about a millionth the time of the modern, I think that this actually improves this quite a bit. But if we go back to our O2 estimates, and we actually break up the oxygen people into our high camp and our low camp, okay? And we just ask, what are the actual consequences for the ancient Earth if we choose different views of Earth history, whether it was a high oxygen Proterozoic or a low oxygen one? We actually generate very different results for productivity. So here in our high oxygen case, from varying O2 from 1 to 10% modern, we get about 41% of modern GPP. If we go to lower oxygen from 0.1 to 1%, we get about 6% of modern GPP. Okay? And so this describes two very different planets that could have existed. So in the first case, in the high oxygen world, it basically means that if we were to take the modern Earth and kill all the life on the continents, okay, or at least accelerate our efforts today, maybe we could say, we basically end up in the Proterozoic, okay? Because modern productivity is about 55% on the continents, 45% in the oceans. If we go to the low oxygen case, we're sitting at about 15% of modern marine productivity, okay? And this seems to be a bit more consistent with models of phosphorus-limited Proterozoic oceans, or perhaps limits placed by nitrogen fixation in the biosphere due to trace metal limitations and different forms of nitrogenase, or perhaps things that are a function of a less complex biosphere, or maybe just less nutrient delivery from continental weathering. Okay, so even though I favor this, we can't really weigh in too much. Okay, so now if we zoom out at the whole Proterozoic record, okay, what do we find? Again, we're going to sample these triple oxygen isotope results. We're going to go through the similar approach that I just showed, varying different atmospheric parameters, and see what we get. And we produced a gross primary production curve that looks like this. So starting before the Proterozoic, I'm just connecting previous Archean estimates that have just done an accounting of what metabolisms they thought existed and how much energy that could derive from the solid Earth. And then we move into the Great Oxidation Event, and it should be pretty clear that we have some pretty insane values, okay? So one is modern productivity, okay? And we have some estimates that take us incredibly high. Okay? And what you're looking at is these box and whisker plots that show this full variation in the whiskers, about 66% of values in the boxes, and the median values in the yellow bars. Okay? And then as we move from the GOE into the mid-Proterozoic, we have much lower productivity. It starts to rise again in the later Proterozoic, and then eventually we connect with Phanerozoic records. Now, some of these values are difficult to explain. And remember, we tried to be conservative in our calculations, assuming every triple auction value is valid. One can make an argument that most negative values are actually the most representative of the ancient Earth, as well as perhaps some of the high O2 and low CO2 estimates might not be reasonable. So one can make an argument that actually the lower green curve here is what might be the most representative of the ancient Earth. And I just want to draw your attention as well, if we think about really, really high productivity times like the GOE perhaps, or some of these late Proterozoic values that give us results that are even more productive than today, these are entirely reliant on really, really high atmospheric oxygen estimates that have been put out there. So for example, across the GOE, results from Aviv Bakan and Lee Kump, they've speculated that perhaps during Earth's Great Oxidation Event, we had values up to 200% modern, okay, double the modern atmospheric inventory. And why you can do that is you don't have trees on land to combust, okay, so you can get oxygen quite a lot higher. But what we're doing here is showing that there's real biospheric consequences to throwing out such values. That maybe if you think that you had oxygen that high in the past and we say we need a biosphere that is about 10 times the modern, perhaps that just doesn't really work, okay? Similarly, there's some fluid inclusion results from the Neoproterozoic, highly controversial results where people think that they can measure direct O2 concentrations from fluid inclusions in salts, okay? But I think there's very good arguments that those results are wrong or at least misinterpreted, but at least these results show that there's serious biospheric consequences for throwing out these kinds of values for the ancient Earth, okay? Again, without a terrestrial biosphere, this is really asking a lot from the marine environment if you want to put forward such high productivity numbers. This isn't to say that everything's lost over some of these intervals. So what we have here is just results that are zooming in across the GOE, just looking at the transition during the Great Oxidation Event and right after in the Paleoproterozoic. Okay, so this is about 2 billion years and then just after. And so you see we have values that cluster much less positive, much less negative in the GOE, and then we go much more negative right afterwards, okay? And even if we don't vary O2, so for example, the red curve shows, of course, that we have higher O2 over the Great Oxidation Event, and then we go to lower O2 values, we have this huge drop in primary production. But even if we don't vary O2, just based on our CAP17 results, it still requires around an order of magnitude change in primary production. So I think there's still something real in this triple auction isotope record, even if you don't pay attention too much to some of the outliers in atmospheric measurements. And so I'll just leave you with a few final thoughts and then open this up to questions. So I think that the triple auction isotope record in sulfate definitely provides a record that I think can be interpreted as changes to the biosphere, okay? Even if we vary CO2 and other parameters that should be shifting the signal around, I still think that there's a real signal in productivity that we can pull out. And again, I think that one thing it does is it really highlights some of the implications for some of the previous atmospheric estimates, okay? So one example is just these really high O2 estimates. And I think it would be really interesting to couple our results to things like biogeochemical models and say, does this work, or do these high productivity numbers break things like the phosphorus cycle or the nitrogen cycle, requiring a revisiting of these O2 values? Okay. Another point is that that I didn't really underscore too much in this talk, but I think that even if you don't believe anything I told you today, you think that these results should be interpreted another way, that's fine. But I think the CAP17 results, one thing they do is they unambiguously provide evidence for an ozone layer as soon as we get these mass-independent fractionations. Okay, so I think it's a very interesting question to ask then, how much O2 do we actually need in the atmosphere to get this ozone cycle going? And even though there's a lot of debate about what the lower limit of oxygen was for some of these broad intervals of Earth history, I'd argue that figuring that out would actually provide the best lower limit we have. Okay, and people haven't really revisited this problem for quite a long time. And then again, the hope again is with this record that it actually starts attracting some people that are interested in modern atmospheric processes. That at least now we have a record that puts out some ideas, at least to shoot down, if nothing else. But I hope that it starts to attract attention for things like stratosphere-tropospheric exchange, which is going to be very important in refining these values through Earth history. So just before I finish, just want to thank all the people that have contributed to this work. It's been a large amount of effort in gathering samples, providing lab space, but I just want to point out Galen Halverson and Boz Wing, supervisors for my PhD. Galen's at McGill, Boz is now at UC Boulder, and then Huiming Bao at LSU, where I did all my auction isotope analyses. So I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Is the ozone concentration in the stratosphere will not affect the rate of production of this class?
Yeah, and then that would have some impact on, be some function of what the O2 concentration is as well.
No, so, simple.
No, not simply at all. So the way that we calibrated this was just by people that have done O2, CO2 experiments just in a reactor. And obviously some of the oxygen, when you start to photochemically dissociate that, is going to produce ozone and stuff. But again, how those concentrations would change. So for example, if we think about, imagine we didn't stop CFC production in the past and killed off all the ozone, what would that do to our triple oxygen values? Yeah, it would certainly change the expression of these signals, but I'm not exactly sure exactly how much it would. But projecting that to Earth through the past is very difficult. Yeah. Sorry if I didn't really answer in a clear way.
Yeah. How are your results with say, Canfield Ocean?
So one of the, I think, improvements that have been made for the model of Earth history is that I think people like Dick Holland pointed this out immediately when that paper came out, but the Canfield Ocean just doesn't work. Okay, like Euxinia kills itself. So it's like, how could we produce all this H2S in the water column and still maintain primary production to supply the organic matter for that sulfate reduction to keep that cycle going? I think what's been shown from doing a lot of things like iron speciation is that the oceans were probably dominated by ferruginous conditions. Now you definitely have euxinic environments in local settings and fairly productive waters, but this wouldn't be the norm for the majority of the Proterozoic ocean.
No, but if I understand right, the Canfield Ocean basically saying, okay, we have low oxygen, and therefore we will have the weathering of sulfate will be a relatively minor process into the Proterozoic ocean. So basically only start seeing sulfate effects in the most superficial, the shallow level rocks, whereas the deep ocean will be more ferruginous, and so that's where you get your ferruginous records from. But at the same time, the samples that you are taking are evaporites. They're very shallow. I mean, they're in contact with the atmosphere,
Sure.
which is the good point of your work.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know.
So if I like, one thing I would say is that it makes this record, maybe you have more confidence in it. If you don't have this large marine sulfate reservoir for a big swath of Earth history where you have a lot of microbial sulfur cycling, perhaps even in basins that are attracting some marine sulfate getting in, just even from shallow waters, that perhaps there's less opportunity for isotopic resetting in exchange with seawater, that you'd actually have a better preservation of these signals in the past than today. Does that answer?
I guess my question was basically a mass balance question. That if the limited sulfate that's coming into the ocean is being taken up by a thick evaporite sequence, or is being taken up by just carbonate, then you have a very different mass balance relationship with the source, which is the atmosphere. and this will affect your signal. So what I was impressed with was the profundity of your signal, that it was actually so very, very clearly defined. So it's more a point than a question, but surely the mass balance issues of the actual sedimentation are also very important in these models, right?
So one of the difficulties, though, with any evaporite records is that you only get them when a basin's restricted anyways. And so once that occurs, whether it's like the Messinian salinity crisis or anything, you're automatically going to shift from, okay, you have your original sulfate in those waters, but then you're going to be more influenced from from whatever that basin's pulling for continentally derived waters. And so this record, all it can really say is that you do have some pristine signatures, but getting at mass balance questions of the sulfur cycle, people are attacking this with things like sulfur isotopes and saying, for example, in the Neoproterozoic, you have this reappearance of massively bedded sulfates, and people have been playing with models of could this actually crash sulfate levels in the ocean from this sink all of a sudden popping up. But in terms of these signals, I think all that really matters is that you just have some opportunity to oxidize pyrite and then you capture it somewhere. It doesn't have to be a big deposit, right? It just has to be somewhere that might not have anything to do with the marine environment. Yeah.
Can you say something about the signal that saw during Snowball Earth?
Yeah, I have slides for that. So for those of you who don't study deep time Snowball Earth, we can imagine that we have like higher CO2 relative to modern, just a little bit because of a dimmer sun. Something happened. People really debate what that was, but we eventually start growing ice sheets. And if the atmosphere doesn't recover in time, you reach a certain threshold where you're reflecting so much sunlight back into space that you have basically locked the Earth into a snowball. And this is incredibly stable because you're reflecting so much sunlight back out to space that the albedo of the planet's being so dramatically shifted that you should stay here for a very long time. But luckily, volcanoes erupt and we raise our greenhouse gas compositions, and eventually we deglaciate the planet. And so a prediction of the Snowball Earth hypothesis is that you actually have incredibly high CO2, like perhaps up to a bar, maybe only like 0.2 bar, something like that, but levels that are just not possible on an unglaciated planet with surface weathering reactions. And so, did I put this in? Yeah, and so the interpretation of this, so here's where these signals have been found, just basically all over the planet, is that in the aftermath of a snowball Earth, you'd have a huge amount of primary production because you have this flood of nutrients into the ocean. And when you couple that observation based on various lines of evidence, whether it's huge thick stacks of black shales, some isotope proxies, you can interpret this as a CO2 record. And so initially when these results were published, they were very, very well received by people like Paul Hoffman because this seemed to provide a geochemical marker that was a direct prediction of snowball Earth. Okay, so that's the interpretation of those. And so it's a little bit more complicated to tease apart what it could mean for productivity because your CO2 could vary over such a huge amount that it creates a lot more ambiguity in that signal. Yeah.
One more quick question.
In the same issue, I noticed that you your envelope allow for high productivity during the cryogenic.
Yeah.
At least, so how come?
Oh, okay. So, oopsies. I think what you're drawing attention to is that I stupidly didn't darken this far. No, I'm not inferring that there would be high productivity over the cryogenian. I should have made that point. No, productivity levels over that period should have been like a fledgling biosphere. So you clearly have to preserve metabolisms that evolved, but it would be the least productive biosphere probably ever on the planet.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Impressive talk. Matthews.
Oh, nice to meet you.
I worked with Osemtes, but I worked with different experiments.
Okay.
But I've been working with isotopes.
Oh, okay.
Research departments that able to produce stuff with max. But I was very impressed by the big benefits.
Have you been following Sarah Swanson? Which is the geofreshman students?
No,
so she's got a couple of papers out there that's trying to like question iron species and
yeah, I know what's going on. It works on people what you can pick up from our investigation, what's going on in the market. As it goes back. One of my students is working on data set.
So are you based at Hebrew University?
Yeah, Hebrew University.
Yeah.
But the story's funny because Mark Stevens and I were postdocs together in Chicago. We shared the same room. I was doing high temperature experiments. Mark had already been starting to work things out. He'd already read Russian literature. He was already, it wasn't really till he went to left Chicago and went to San Diego. And he really started.
Yeah. So did he come here to visit when he was out?
Oh, he's been several times.
Yeah. Did he come here last visit? Because he was a Weitzman for a while.
Yeah, he was when he came
there's another guy who I met a few times at the ESC who also came out of Chicago. What the heck was his name? Do you know what I'm talking about? Geological Survey of Canada. Came out of Chicago. No, not Carlos Mullenbox. What the heck was his name? Anyways, he built a mass spec over his PhD there.
Yeah. Okay, I know his name. I forgot.
Yeah. Anyway, but it sounds like it's an amazing place to work.
Blake himself was from McGill.
Oh yeah.
Cool. Okay, great. Anyway, good luck. You carry on.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for coming. See you. Hi, how's it going? Peter.
I'm Flori.
Flori, nice to
I'm
meet
a
you.
postdoc with my kids, but we will take it to lunch next.
Okay, great. Yeah, see you.
Shelley. Yes, I'm Shelley.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. It was a really interesting talk.
Thanks. Are you guys doing oxygen stuff too?
Yeah, we're doing triple oxygen isotopes as well.
That's great. I should come here more often. There's nobody.
I'm doing triple oxygen isotopes. Well, we are in carbonates, not in sulfate. So it's a different application, but it's really interesting to hear about this one.
Yeah. There's not really anyone to talk to at Weitzman about this stuff. So.
Yeah, I imagine the community is pretty small.
Yeah, still.
Cool.
Yes,
All right,
to
see
meet
you
you.
guys.
I just want to know if you have some kind of an article about the subject that I can further read.
Yeah, sure.
Just tell me where to look.
Yeah, so there was a paper out this year in Nature.
Ah, great. What's like name?
So if you just
what to look for?
If you just look triple oxygen.
Ah, okay.
Nature triple oxygen.
Triple.
Yeah.
Oxygen. Na.
Yeah, and then you should be able to find that, no problem.
Thank you.
Cool, no problem. Thanks for coming.
You like, since the year began, you're the first one that has the questions. All of the latest lectures here, nobody asks questions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's really good vibe.
אלון אנגל, יבגני מרגל, אנגר, אחר כך שניה, אחר כך נגיד.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Okay, so this is what we'll do. Alon will take it now, and he will take you to Evgeny after, and tell Evgeny, thank you very much, tell Evgeny to take you to Hagit,
Okay.
and the students will come to pick you up from Hagit,
Okay.
and after that, tell the students to take you to Alon Amrani.
Okay.
And then you are doing whatever you want.
Okay, perfect. Cool.
It was a great having you. It was a great tour.
Yeah, come to the Whiteman at some point.
At some point.
It's closer than here. Just take the train to the station.
That's true.
Okay. We're gonna have yours.
Okay, perfect. Send me the people that you mentioned. The one.
Yeah, Will and yeah.
Please, okay?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Enjoy.
Thanks.
Proszę.